Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for APA Lawyers' Perspectives on Allyship series. My name is Shinhong Byun, and I'm a board member of Cal-APABA. Each week, we'll be focusing on a different aspect of allyship. Our hope is that this series will lead to further meaningful conversations and action. Thank you also to the 190 attendees who joined us on Tuesday, and to the lawyers and sister bar organizations in California who rallied to support this series. Today's topic is Asian solidarity and division in the age of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Some important questions we would like our attendees to think about today are, where do we as Asian Americans fit in the United States race relations? Have we contributed to the problems unknowingly or perhaps even knowingly? Can we set aside individual need for the sake of a larger cause? These are hard questions that are uncomfortable to ask and can't be answered all at once, but we can at least begin this dialogue today. So today, asking the difficult questions and leading us into meaningful conversations will be our very own warrior leader, Zathrina Perez, president of Cal-APABA.
Thank you, Shinhong. Today's discussion will begin with a presentation by Dr. Russell Jeung. Dr. Jeung is the chair and a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He is the author of books exploring the sociology of race, the sociology of religion, and social movements. He has co-produced with Valerie So the documentary The Oak Park Story, about a landmark housing lawsuit involving his fellow Cambodian and Latino tenants. Dr. Jeung also is extensively engaged in community-based participatory research with Asian American communities, the Asian Pacific. Just this year, Dr. Jeung launched Stop AAPI Hate, a project of Chinese for Affirmative Action, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and SF State Asian American Studies. This project tracks COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop community resources and policy interventions to fight racism. I would now like to turn things over to Dr. Jeung.
Thank you, Zathrina, and thank you, Shinhong, and thank you, Cal-APABA, for inviting me today. I'm grateful to be a part of your series on allyship. And, as I was thinking about it, the question of solidarity has really, for me, in terms of, given my own personal life and in my own career work, how have I been enacting solidarity with the African American community has been a live issue, especially when already I've been so active in anti-Asian activism. So for me, the question is, I'm already doing a lot in my career and personal life. How much more can I actually expand my activism to address anti-Blackness in society and to support Black Lives Matter? Today, I'm going to talk a lot about sociological theories of where Asian Americans stands in the racial hierarchy of the United States. But I don't want this to just be a dry academic sociological exercise. I think what I'd like for you, as you hear the presentation, is to figure out, where do you individually stand in race relations in the United States, and then collectively to also think in terms of a collective sense, where do Asian Americans, are they positioned, and how are they positioned both to help and further racial justice in the United States, and where are they positioned to actually maintain the status quo, which is actually very unequal and inequitable. So I'd like to start off with the case of Thao. He's the Hmong American police officer who was at the scene when George Floyd was murdered and choked. And the question arises when you see images of Thao at that site, is how complicit are Asian Americans with white supremacy? How much have we bought into a system that brutalizes African Americans? That how much have we benefited from a system that has been genocidal? And as voluntary immigrants, how much are we participating in and contributing to the American empire that actually oppresses large groups of people? So if you see Thao, again, he's an officer. He arrived at the crime scene with Officer Chauvin, And then he held back the crowds while Officer Chauvin actually choked George Floyd. So he stood by and did nothing with it. And so that he could be a symbol of Asian Americans, we may think we're outside the white-black dynamic, and we just sort of stand on the sidelines watching and feeling like, oh, we have nothing to do with white-black relations. We're absolved from any responsibility from white-black relations. We haven't ever owned slaves. So we're innocent and not complicit. Officer Thao was actually the subject of a police brutality lawsuit in 2017, and there were actually 6 complaints of police misconduct already against him. So you could say, oh, yeah, he's just one of those bad apple cops, just an individual. And so as an individual police officer, I, as an Asian American, can distance myself from him. He's maybe doesn't represent all police officers, and he doesn't represent Asian American police officers, and he doesn't represent the Asian American community. And so you could take that point of view and socially distance yourself. That's being on, oh, yeah, Asian Americans are on the side of race relations, and Asian Americans are distanced from bad apples. That could be one argument. But for me, and I think Asian Americans sometimes have a different sense of their sense of group identity, is when I see an officer like Thao, I actually feel ashamed as an Asian American. I feel that Thao does represent the group, that he does represent Asian Americans, that I'm part of that group that now has been shamed. And I think it's actually very legitimate to actually have that sense of group corporate responsibility over an issue like this. Whereas most Americans who grew up more hyper-individualistic, they can say, well, that he's just an individual and I'm an individual and we're not responsible for each other. We're separate and we're autonomous. I would argue with an Asian American collective perspective, I actually feel that sense of shame. I sort of own him as part of my community, and I can't abandon him as part of my community. And so that creates an issue for me. What do I do when part of my community does shame me, does do something wrong, and how do we take ownership of it as a community? So those are part of the issues. Are we complicit? Is Thao a representative of our community? And you can say, if we're complicit and a part of white supremacy, then are Asian Americans white? So that's another question. You can challenge that question about whether Asian Americans are white by looking at Thao's Hmong background. Hmong refugees, since they came here, have resettled in low-income neighborhoods, a lot where I live now. So I live in East Oakland in California, where a lot of refugees are resettled. It's one of the lowest income neighborhoods in the Bay Area. And Hmong community has actually a higher poverty rate than the African American community. So you may also challenge this argument, oh, how can Hmong and Asian Americans be complicit in white supremacy when there are large segments of our community who aren't at the status of whites? We're low income ourselves, we're poor ourselves, we face similar class issues that African Americans face, so how can you argue that we're complicit with white supremacy? So the case of Thao is a complicated one, and as a community, Asian American community member, I don't want to disown him. I have to acknowledge that he's part of my community and he does reflect part of my community. So where do Asians stand on this white-black continuum in American race relations? Are we complicit with white supremacy, or do we stand on the side of African Americans? Historically, Asians have been constructed as African Americans, as Black in US history. And I'm going to just give you a couple examples of why in broader American society, Asians were seen to be like Blacks. As early as 1854, in the case of People versus Hall, Hall was a white person who shot and killed Chinese and white people. Chinese testified against Hall and he was convicted and found guilty. Hall appealed, saying these Chinese witnesses, their testimony shouldn't be allowed. It went to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court agreed. Chinese were like Blacks. They weren't allowed to testify against whites. And so In that decision, Asians were effectively disenfranchised and silenced, having no voice in the American court system, especially against whites. In Ganglum versus Rice in 1927, Ganglum wanted his daughter to be able to attend schools with whites, and the Supreme Court ruled no, Chinese are not white, they're more black, and therefore it's fair and equal to have separate schools for Chinese to separate them from whites. And anti-miscegenation laws again agreed Asians are more like blacks and they therefore can't marry whites. And even today, in a book by Aiwa Ong, a lot of social workers, a lot of community members view the Asian American underclass, those who are welfare dependent, those who have high gang rates, those who have high teenage pregnancy rates, they're much more again like blacks than they are whites. And so that's how we're constructed as black. Historically, Asian Americans have recognized this and have also recognized that, well, whites have the power, whites have the privilege. We want to have the same status as whites. We want to have the same citizenship as whites. So Ozawa in 1922 appealed to the courts. Asian Americans could not be naturalized. He tried to be naturalized and said, I'm culturally American, white American. I've become Christian. I've raised my children in American public schools. But the US Supreme Court denied him citizenship and said, sorry, you're not white, and so you can't become a citizen. Then in 1923, acknowledged that, okay, only Caucasians can become American citizens. So Thin argued that South Asians, Indians, should be considered eligible for naturalization because Indians were Caucasians. They were not Mongoloids. That went to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court again ruled that, no, you're really not white. It's common knowledge that Hindu people are not white, and therefore you can't become a citizen. And so as much as Asian Americans tried to gain white status, or at least the rights of white citizenship, we were denied historically. But starting in the middle of the 20th century, Asian Americans began to gain some measure of whiteness in terms of privilege, in terms of rights. During World War II, when the United States was at war with Japan, it benefited the United States in the geopolitical sense to actually side with China and say the Chinese are the good Asians because we're both fighting the Japanese, and the Chinese could be loyal and good allies. So in that sense, Chinese were elevated as the good Asian while pitted against Japanese as the bad Asians. During the civil rights era, when the Black Power movement threatened the racial order in the United States, politicians and media again raised up the good Asian as the model minority as compared to other minorities who loot and have uprisings over riots. They would argue Asian Americans face discrimination, but they work hard, they're quiet, they're industrious, and therefore they should be the model minority rather than these who complain too much. The model minority gets further cemented with the selective immigration of a certain class of Asian Americans. Since 1990, and it started in the 1965 Immigration Act, but in 1990, those who have professional degrees, those with higher educational degrees, were allowed to come in, so that only those Asians who were of a certain class background were allowed to enter as the United States with visas and considered deserving Americans. And so that's the construction of the model minority. It's not that we're culturally or naturally more hardworking, it's just that society has elevated Asian Americans to be a wedge against other groups and have selectively picked a certain class of Asian Americans to come. So again, to represent the model minority, I have a picture of Stanford students in the mid-'80s. These are my fellow classmates. I wasn't considered one of those models, but my classmates were because they had such a drive to excel. So this is the race relations dynamics that Asian Americans find themselves in. And we often ask ourselves, are we Black or are we white? And during Black Lives Matter, we're wondering, wow, Black Lives Matter because they've been considered inferior, and we have to elevate them to acknowledge how much their lives do matter. And so do we align ourselves with Blacks, or do we align ourselves with whites who've historically and even today are socially, culturally, and economically higher? And so again, for most immigrants, the logic is if you come here voluntarily, you want to gain status, you want to gain wealth, you want to gain belonging. And to do so, then you try to avoid Blackness and you try to assume and gain whiteness. That would be the logic of immigration. It's not like we want to be white, but we want white privilege, we want white status. However, the Thao case and the positioning of Asians as either white or Black has been really difficult because, of course, we are neither white nor Black, and we aren't often seen as equals to being whites, and we're also not often seen as in community with African Americans. And so Asian Americans actually have a different racial positioning. Sometimes we were historically constructed as whites, sometimes we're elevated to be honorary whites, but for the most part, Asian Americans have a different racial dimension by which they face racism, and that sort of positions them in the American hierarchy. And this racial dimension isn't between whether we're superior or inferior, it's whether we're considered insiders to the United States or outsiders, whether we are really belong as real Americans or whether we're considered outsiders to the United States. If we gain insider status, then we are the model minority. We fit in, we belong, we're part of America. But as outsiders, we're often sort of grouped together like with the Latinos, the Latinx community, with Arabs, as perpetual foreigners. We're again seen as outsiders, and people ask us, where are you from? Because they assume you're not really a real American. So I'm going to give you some examples of how Asian Americans are racialized, not as whites, not as Blacks, but actually as outsiders. And actually, a lot of American legislation, a lot of American policies have actually constructed Asians as permanent outsiders. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first act against a racial group that excluded us, said no, Asians are excludable, they're not assimilable, and so therefore America has the right to bar entry of Asian migrants. The Alien Land Law of 1913 said since Asians can't become naturalized, they're aliens, and aliens who are again outsiders, non-Americans, can't be allowed to own land in California. Japanese American wartime incarceration is another example of how we're racialized as the outsider. Even though most of the 100,000 Japanese Americans interned during World War II were citizens, they were still considered disloyal, possibly traitorous, and therefore incarcerated. In more recent policies, the Muslim ban says we can exclude these groups of people. We can register and detain people who are Muslim. And now, even today, we have high rates of Southeast Asian deportation. Asians who are not citizens legally are now considered what we call probationary Americans. They can become Americans if they're good enough, if they merit it enough, if they're useful to the American economy enough. But if not, then they're disposable. We can easily deport them, no matter whether they fought for the CIA during the secret wars against Laos or in the Cambodian Vietnam Wars. Even though they're permanent legal residents, even though they came involuntarily as refugees, they can now be deported because they don't have the same rights as American citizens. And finally, I want to just share with you quickly how Asians have been cemented as perpetual foreigners, especially during COVID-19. When COVID-19 began to hit the US shores, we knew that Asian Americans would face racism and be scapegoated for bringing the disease. We knew that Asian Americans would then face discrimination and interpersonal violence, and we knew that racist policies would be enacted against Asian Americans. And that's why we created Stop AAPI Hate. We needed to document this discrimination in order to show, again, because we're the model minority, we have to prove that we face racism. We have to document it so that policymakers and corporations would pay attention to us and actually address the issue. So we created this reporting center, and immediately we were flooded with hundreds of responses. Oh, wait. And you could see here in this chart, we face over 2,000 cases to date, and it's continually rising. And most of the issues are verbal harassment and being shunned. But these aren't microaggressions, but rather they're really traumatizing experiences, traumatizing enough that Asian Americans will report about it and recognize it's unfair. A lot of times people are yelled at in their face with profanity, with a lot of racial epithets slung at them, and oftentimes with elderly and children present. So these aren't microaggressions. Again, they're just a widespread, pervasive daily experience. This happens so much so that 80 to 90% of Asian Americans now fear racial bias because of this hate incidents. About 9% of the cases actually deal with civil rights violations. And this is where Cal-APABA could help us. A lot of times we're being mistreated at the workplace. If an Asian coughs, they're sent home. If a non-Asian coughs, they're just sort of saying, disregarded. We're barred from hotels and restaurants, and we're barred from ride shares. And a lot of these issues, again, Cal-APABA could help by providing referral and resources for our respondents. The last major category is being coughed upon and having physical assaults. Asian Americans were coughed and spat upon so much when we read the incident reports that we actually created a separate category for this type of discrimination. My own wife got coughed on when she went jogging purposefully. Elderly and children are getting spat upon. I think it's really dehumanizing and debasing. In the East Coast, one white person got arrested for terrorism for coughing on grocery produce and coughing on the white cashier. So you can argue that because Asian Americans are experiencing this behavior, we're experiencing mass terrorism. It's a public health threat. It's a real common occurrence of this sort of weird behavior. In terms of physical assault, Asian Americans are getting pushed and shoved, having rocks and bottles thrown at them. The worst case scenario happened in Texas when a refugee family from Burma, they weren't even Chinese, were attacked from behind, and the two kids and the dad were slashed in the heads. And that's now being investigated as a hate crime. You can see most of these confrontations occur at business sites, at corporate retail sites, because that's where Asians come in contact with others. But prior to shelter in place, a lot of the issues were at public transit and sidewalks and parks. And we have less incidents occurring at school, although we think that schools have a lot of youth bullying. And so we're actually starting this summer a youth campaign to get Asian American youth to report. And you can see in the suspected reason for discrimination that most people think it's because of their race they're being discriminated against. 60% of our respondents are not Chinese. There are people who look Chinese and assume to be Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Koreans. This month, a Latino in Southern California and an indigenous person in Vancouver, they were both attacked and said, go back to China. And so they too, because of how they looked, experienced anti-Asian discrimination. Another unique factor about discrimination against Asian Americans at this time is the face mask. Early on, Asian Americans were the few people who wore face masks, so they were seen as more likely to be diseased and infected, and so they were shunned or attacked. Now, because everybody's supposed to wear face masks, Asians are face discrimination if they're not wearing a face mask. You're still considered diseased and affected, but you're being negligent by not wearing a face mask. Gender is actually a big factor in discrimination. Women face harassment 2.4 times higher than men. So why are we facing so much discrimination now? Why are we being racialized as the other? I'm going to argue it's because we have that historic stereotype of being the Yellow Peril. This stereotype says that Asians are a threat to the West, that Asians would come and dominate the West, and especially we would dominate with our nameless, faceless hordes who are disease carriers. And in the 19th century, that was one of the bases for the Chinese Exclusion Act. You can see in this picture that malaria, smallpox, and leprosy, these were the three specters of death emanating out of San Francisco Chinatown, you can see here. And again, these three diseases would be Grim Reapers who would bring death to the United States. Again, that became the basis of the Chinese Exclusion Act, that Chinese bring disease, Chinese are pagans, and Chinese steal jobs from white workers. What happened then is, with this sort of stereotyping as the Yellow Peril, again, Chinese faced interpersonal violence. 300 Chinese settlements were actually driven out during that time. My own family that had settled in Monterey for 40 years, their Chinese village was burned down, and they were all driven out of Monterey. And we, again, faced racist legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act. This pattern of history continued in 1900 when the bubonic plague came. Again, a disease comes from China, and Chinese were met with interpersonal violence. They were here segregated in San Francisco Chinatown. Chinatown was roped off, and barbed wire was put up. Whites were allowed to leave Chinatown, but Chinese had to remain to get infected and quarantined. In Honolulu and Santa Ana Chinatowns, they were actually burned down because of the fear of the bubonic plague, leaving thousands of Chinese homeless and ironically spreading the rats who had the disease. So you could say history repeats itself, and this is a San Francisco Chronicle article that talks about those eerie parallels. Again, a disease comes, Asians are blamed, Asians face interpersonal violence, and Asians face racist health policies. Because of disease, Chinese and Asians were excluded, they were quarantined, they were detained at Angel Island, and they're deported. And even today, that same pattern occurs, as you see that Asians have met over 2,000 cases of anti-Asian hate. And in terms of racist legislation, Trump instituted the mass immigration ban, and he's now, Republicans are calling for stopping visas to Chinese students. So we actually have the second Chinese Exclusion Act now. So Asians are still framed as outsiders, and you can see with political framing, anti-China rhetoric is actually now a wedge issue. Right in the middle of the pandemic and right in the middle of the Black Lives Matter uprising, all Trump could talk about was that there's a plague from China that needs to be controlled. So again, scapegoating China is his way to deflect attention away from his mismanagement of the pandemic and to avoid addressing the racial issues facing African Americans. So again, Asian Americans are seen as the scapegoat and as a wedge to drive whites against Asians and to avoid attention to African Americans. You could see this strategy here. There was actually a 47-page Republican campaign strategy document that actually said Republicans should blame China as their central campaign theme. As a result, China gets scapegoated, China gets bashed, and so Asians in America get bashed. That's what we see. There's a clear connection between anti-Chinese rhetoric and what Asian Americans are experiencing as outsiders and as being as disease carriers. This goes along with how white supremacy has enabled the racial disparities of the disease. Just this week, CDC said African Americans and the Hispanic community have the highest rates of COVID-19. So does the Navajo Nation. Asian Americans and Latino are the most economically hard hit. Oh, African Americans too, in terms of unemployment and in terms of business loss. So COVID-19 has exposed the racial inequalities, and that's partially why you see uprisings in support of Black Lives Matter. So quickly to summarize, you could see Sometimes in the past, because of legislation, we were constructed like blacks. But for most of our history, and even today, we're more constructed as outsiders, as Asian Americans. Especially during COVID-19, people are telling us to go back to where we belong, go back home. You're Chinese, you're effing Chinese, you brought the disease. And so we're often being blamed and attacked for being outsiders who don't belong here. So again, that's a different racial dynamic. White supremacy employs both dimensions of racism to subjugate non-white populations and to maintain white privilege, white power, and white status. But where Asian Americans stand in the racial dynamic, it varies because we're not necessarily like blacks. We haven't been racialized like blacks. We don't necessarily experience the same racial experiences and racial profiling that African Americans do. And so understanding the distinct ways we've been racialized helps us understand why sometimes we could identify and find solidarity with African Americans, and why sometimes even African Americans may view Asians as outsiders and discriminate against Asians as outsiders. So it's both and. We're neither black nor white, but we're both outside of the white-black dynamics, and we can understand black-white dynamics. So can we find solidarity with African Americans if we're racialized differently? I would argue, and in these incidents of solidarity, we can find solidarity against white supremacy overall. The 1955 Bandung Conference was a conference of African and Asian nations that came together in Indonesia to assert their independence from both the First World, the US and Europe, and the Second World, the Soviet Union. The school that I come from, San Francisco State, in 1968, the Third World Liberation Front comprised of Chicano, 3 separate Asian student groups, and American Indian groups. They worked with the Black Student Union to launch the longest strike at a university, and they were together able to develop the College of Ethnic Studies, today the only one. I love this picture. This is a picture of an Oakland High School student, and she actually, with her fellow classmates, cut class in 1968 for a memorial of Bobby Hutton, a Black Panther, and you can see them raising their fists in salute. More recently, there was a lot of animosity and tension because of the LA riots after the Rodney King, and there's the media portrayed it as a Black Korean conflict. But really, out of that uprising came a lot of solidarity. And since the 1990s, there have been Korean Black Ministers Association. I just want to highlight the faith-based groups. They've been actually still meeting today, 20 years, 30 years later, still in working together to identify their common faith and their common hopes for their communities. So I'd just like to conclude with one more case that sort of complicates this issue of where Asian Americans stands and illustrates where Asian Americans stands. If you don't know about the case of Officer Peter Liang, he was a New York police officer who was patrolling a housing authority project. In the dark, he heard a loud noise. He had his gun drawn, and it accidentally went off. The shot ricocheted and killed a Kai girlie in a stairwell below in 2014. Peter Liang got convicted of manslaughter, and he was the first New York police officer convicted of an on-duty shooting in a decade. The African American community, especially Black Lives Matter, said, "Oh, here's another example of police brutality, of the criminal justice system unfairly surveilling and controlling African American bodies." The Chinese and Asian American community said, "No, wait, this is unfair. Why is he being scapegoated as a police officer? White police officers always get off. They don't even get charged." For example, in 2004, a white officer shot Timothy Stansbury in the same situation accidentally, but the officer wasn't even indicted. Chinese and Asians said, wow, again, Asians are considered other. We don't have the same status as whites. This is unfair. So both communities argue that this case illustrated the racisms of their experience. African Americans as being subjected to a system that incarcerates them. Asians complain it's unjust as a system that denies us the same treatment that whites do. And so you could see in the Peter Liang case, again, you see African Americans are justified in complaining, wow, the system really kills Black bodies. Asian Americans complain, wow, we aren't getting the same rights and benefits that whites do. And so, but again, because we're in different racial positions, we're pitted against each other, Peter Liang as a Chinese American officer and the African American community. We can find solidarity overall against the system that oppresses both groups, but the system benefits when these two groups are driven apart from each other, when a wedge is driven between them. And for example, when Chinese are scapegoated for the coronavirus. So I hope this makes sense. So in conclusion, we have these either or binaries. Are Asians white or Black? Are Asians complicit with white supremacy, or are we in solidarity with African Americans? And I would argue yes to each of those statements. Both statements can be true, that Asian Americans are complicit with white supremacy and anti-Black. Asians also do resist racism as a subjugated people of color and do work in solidarity with African Americans. So both statements can be true. And that's because Asian Americans are racially positioned along both dimensions, the white-Black continuum and the insider-outsider binary. And depending on the context, we're seen as white or Black or insider or outsider. It's fungible. Our status is precarious and it depends on the context. So anti-racism for the Asian American community entails both and, not either or. It entails both us addressing our own personal racism, our own anti-Blackness, our own prejudices. I would argue that everybody has implicit biases. I have implicit biases against Asians. I have implicit biases against African Americans. And beyond being addressing our individual prejudice, we have to work together to dismantle white supremacy as an overall system that pits groups against each other and creates these racial hierarchies. So I hope that clarifies the racial positioning of Asian Americans. It's both and it's complicated, but we can work in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jeung. We're now shifting into the discussion portion of today's session. I'm going to start off by asking some of my own questions, and then we will turn to questions from the audience. To the audience, if you have a question, please submit it through the comment section. So since you talked about the Officer Liang case first, I think I'll turn to that question first. In that case, you saw, as you stated, many Chinese American and Asian American groups rallying in support of Liang and pressing for him to receive similar treatment to similarly situated white officers. While on the other hand, you had some other Asian American groups join Black Lives Matter and urging stronger punishment in this case, viewing it in the framework of a police brutality case and systemic racism within the police departments. Have you seen a similar dynamic in the case of Officer Thao? How have Asian groups responded to his involvement in the George Floyd case?
Again, it's the both and. I see some people trying to disown him, trying to, we call it ethnic distancing. You just sort of distance yourself from that individual and disassociate and say, oh, he's just a tool of white supremacy. And so I see in some cases people taking the position of Black Lives Matter. I think in the Hmong community, it's actually more difficult, right? Because he is Hmong. You can't deny that. Again, because we have a collective sense of community that you can't disassociate your individual identity from the corporate group identity. The Hmong community has to own him and then have to address their complicity with white supremacy. So that makes it even more difficult for the Hmong community. We're caught in two ways, both owning our anti-Blackness and wanting to dismantle white supremacy. And so when you're in that position, then all groups are against you. The Hmong community says, why are you fighting for Black Lives Matter? Don't you think you should support your Hmong brother? The white community says, why aren't you supporting these officers? And the African American community is saying, why are you supporting your Hmong officer who helped kill our African American brother? So again, we're caught in that difficult position that if we try to straddle both sides, we get attacked from all sides. And so I've seen people take different positions, and to try to straddle taking multiple stances, it's really difficult.
So you also stated how Asian Americans are kind of confronted with two different crises and events right now. We have obviously COVID-19 and the shocking increase in racist acts against Asian Americans, but we're also addressing Black Lives Matter's resurgence due to recent horrific killings of Black men and women, including George Floyd's case. How do we in this moment, so we obviously are experiencing our own trauma and our events in this moment, how do we in this moment discuss anti-Asian hate while not distracting from and also giving support to the issues that are reverberating through the Black community because of the George Floyd case and similar cases?
Right. I think that's a really good issue. And this is what we at Stop AAPI Hate have faced, because our charge is to confront anti-Asian racism. It's continuing during the Black Lives Matter uprising. But again, we also don't want to discenter attention and examination of police brutality and mass incarceration, and to avoid addressing our own anti-Blackness. So what we've done is actually not put out any more press releases during this period of time as much as we would have, and have always sort of made statements in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and acknowledging, again, like what I showed in the chart, that in both cases, anti-Asian racism and in Black Lives Matter, we're both fighting the same white supremacist system. And so we're trying to assert our allyship during this time without decentering Black Lives Matter. But when we are asked, well, what's going on with the Asian community, we say, oh, we're facing all this racism, and that's hopefully would give us solidarity with other communities of color. What I've been telling youth and to other groups is that as Asian Americans face racial profiling as outsiders, being racially profiled as threats, then we should be able to better understand why some groups are facing mass detention and find it unfair. That's why we should understand why some groups are being mass incarcerated and think it's unfair. So again, as Asian Americans are experiencing anti-Asian hate and being racially profiled, that should put us in greater solidarity, greater allyship with other groups who are facing even greater issues with greater extent.
Thank you. So I'm just going to pose one more question, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. You previously mentioned the LA riots, the riots that resulted from the acquittals of the savage beating of Rodney King, and how that resulted in additional allyships between the Korean and Black communities. That obviously is a very sensitive event. It's an event that we'll be discussing in a further session next Tuesday. But for our purposes here, there are some members of the Korean American community and immigrant community that believe Black rioters targeted Korean businesses, and also feel that they didn't get enough support from Chinese and Japanese American communities that time. This, I feel, exemplifies that there are people in our communities that have experienced incidences in their lives or historically conflicts between the Asian and Black communities, and there continue to be some for a lack of a better term, bad blood or bad feelings as a result. How do we confront that and address that so we can overcome it and come together today?
Yeah, there are divisions, historic animosities that we should address. And I think I always like the South African Truth and Reconciliation efforts. And this is what they tried to do in Cambodia, is that we do need the truth to be heard, that if the China, not if, when Korean feel neglected or thrown under the bus or unacknowledged by Chinese and Japanese Americans, then as a Chinese American, I can apologize and say that was wrong. We as Asian Americans should stand up for each other. When we're targeted, we should acknowledge that targeting and address it and not try to avoid the issue of, oh, other racial communities of color also target us. So that's the truth, and we have to acknowledge the truth, and then we also have to apologize, seek reparations, and work together as broader communities. So I think there's a lot of historic animosities between Asians and between Asians and other communities of color and with Asians and whites. And to get past these divisions and to get past these historical divides, we do have to acknowledge them. We have to apologize for them. I think it's actually, from a faith-based perspective and from a restorative justice model, you have to take ownership of your wrongs, even for corporate wrongs. I may not have been there in the past, but I could still say on behalf of my group, that was wrong, and hopefully that leads to greater healing. And part of that healing involves reparations. So that's sort of my restorative justice faith-based model. I think we do need to repent, actually.
Thank you. Now turning to comments and questions from our audience. One comment was, one of the cases that you mentioned was the US v. Bhagat Singh Thind case. I think there was a mention of Thind being Hindu. I think the commentator said that he was Sikh, but my understanding was that in the case, Thind's attorneys actually argued regarding his Hindu caste heritage or high caste Hindu heritage. Is that correct? And can you explain?
Sorry, actually, you may be correct. I don't know the case as well. I thought he was Sikh American, so he wasn't even Hindu. It's just that he was called Hindu because that was the terminology that America used at the time. So the courts ruled him as a Hindu. He is clearly not white, but I thought he was really Sikh American. And so we have to go back and look at that more closely.
Okay, great. We have a couple comments regarding the Officer Liang case. Officer Liang wasn't given the usual support from the police officers union that white officers were given. And also, do we attribute any significance to the fact that Officer Chauvin married a Hmong American? I'm sorry, those are two different comments. One, Officer Liang, one just kind of thoughtful comment was that Officer Liang wasn't given the usual support from the police officers union, and thus was being treated differently by the organizations that was supposed to support him. Do you have any thoughts or comments in response to that?
For the Officer Liang thing, yeah, that's again another example where Officer Liang is sort of positioned as the other and outsider to the police union and to the justice system, and therefore that's why he got tried, that's why he got indicted. That's how you could argue that as a Chinese American, he was treated differently and therefore was a victim of racism. May not have been intentional, but it was a clear difference in treatment that white officers received in the past and what white officers received from the union. Regarding Officer Chauvin married a Hmong woman, again, there's a difference between, and you could have a lot of friends who are Black and still be racist and still be part of a racist system, you know? And so there's a difference between your individual actions and your personal relationships and your actions as an actor or a member of an institution. And so, for example, I may one example is about institutional versus individual racisms and intentional versus unintentional racism is, let's say I treat all my students equally and give them class participation grades, right? And so that's fair. It's stated in the syllabus. If you speak up and participate, you get a higher grade than students who don't. And so that's my policy. And what happens if Chinese students who don't talk as much get lower grades? Does that mean I'm personally prejudiced against Chinese? I go, no, I'm Chinese myself. I have a Chinese kid. How can I be racist against Chinese, right? But my policy as an institutional actor, as a professor, is actually racist against Chinese, because we know certain groups speak out more. We know that it's Asians are raised in general to respect authorities and to not question. So to actually require Asians to participate can be racist because it goes against their ethnic heritage. It's demanding they assimilate to the white male model of communication, and it's disproportionately hurting them. So you could argue that this class participation grade, even though I'm Chinese and I may marry a Chinese person, I can still act institutionally and in terms of policy unfairly to Chinese people. So in the case of Officer Chauvin being married to a Hmong person, yeah, he could fall in love with a Hmong person, but he could still act racistly against the Hmong community or the African American community. So I hope that helps clarify in individual versus institutional racisms.
Thank you.
That's my favorite. I always tell my students, if you get a lower class participation grade, just go and complain your professor's racist, especially in law school.
Okay, so we have one audience member who's requesting your assistance to, how do we explain to our parents, our friends, or loved ones the two-dimensional racial diagram that you presented and the practical impact of it?
You know, a lot of younger people are saying, oh, how do we explain things to our immigrant parents? They seem so traditional and stuck. I don't think that's, I mean, that could be true, but you know, in our Stop the API hate reform, 8% of the respondents are actually elderly, over 6 years old. So you don't think of Asian American elderly people going online, typing and complaining, I've been, you know, a victim of racism, but they are. You don't think of Asian non-English speaking or limited English speaking people saying they're mistreated, but they are reporting it. So it's not beyond their comprehension for immigrants and for the elderly to understand being mistreated as an Asian person. They get it. And quite a large number of them are complaining about it. They get when people treat you differently than how white people are treated. They understand racism. And they do protest, and Asians do protest. Like if you just look at the Hong Kong protests, you get a third of the colony coming out. So how do you explain to your parents? So first of all, you don't stereotype and box your parents in the way they may do to you. But the way I sort of bridge it is, again, you just talk about how their family and friends are now getting racially profiled and mistreated by the system for COVID-19, and then try to draw that bridge and that connection to how others are treated by the criminal justice system and by society overall. So again, just as Asian Americans experience racial profiling and get mistreated as the other, as the threat, then we could explain to our parents, well, you see, other people are seen as a threat and mistreated and racially profiled, and maybe even to a greater extent, and that's really unfair. So what I would do is, again, try to link the experiences that Asian Americans are experiencing during the coronavirus to how other groups are being treated. They're not commensurate, they're not equivalencies, but you can sort of draw the linkage between the two, and hopefully that helps. And then there's that letter, that open letter from the children to their parents about Black Lives Matter. So you can look that up. It's translated in a whole bunch of different diseases.
Thank you. Another question. So in Massachusetts recently, the state's Asian American Commission expressed support for seeking justice following George Floyd's death last month. They issued a pretty strong statement. You can find the statement online, but some of the things that they said was that Asian Americans need to confront their role in quote unquote anti-Black racism and oppression, and noted one of the officers on the scene was Asian, of Asian descent. Asian Americans, quote, will never fully understand the Black experience because they continue to benefit from the model minority myth and our historic proximity to white privilege. And we acknowledge the deep roots of anti-Blackness within the API community and commit to an ongoing and necessary process of healing those wounds. So it was a pretty strong statement. In response, you actually had at least one other Asian American group that took issue with a lot of that language. The co-founder of the Boston chapter of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, one of the oldest Asian American civil rights organizations in the country, believed that the language of the statement was divisive and inflammatory, suggested that Asians benefit from white privilege and are racist and against Black people. What does this back and forth really kind of say about the divisions that we have to address in the Asian American community regarding how we coalesce to address Black issues?
All right. So I think the former statement is strong, and again, it aligns Asians on that white-Black continuum with Blacks. The other group, the latter group, said no. It tried to adopt the model minority position and aligned itself on the insider-outsider positioning. And so that's why they're sort of talking past each other in terms of, are we aligned with Blacks or are we aligned with whites? And it's like they're not talking on the same dimensions of racism. I would actually argue, so it's both and again, that it's true Asian Americans have benefited from positioning more proximate to whiteness, but historically we haven't been that connected to whiteness. And even today now, on the other dimension, we're again identified as perpetual foreigners. So it's both and. We should develop solidarity with African Americans. We should acknowledge our anti-Blackness and then sometimes our proximity to whiteness. But we also can acknowledge we're not always that close to being white. Sometimes we're portrayed as being the outsider, and as outsiders, we could align ourselves with African Americans against the white supremacist system. So I want to sort of avoid getting trapped in that sort of are we white or Black question. It's sort of like the question, are you Asian or American question. These are false binaries, false dichotomies. We could be both and Asian and American.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of today's session. I will now turn things over back to Shin-Hong.
Thank you, Zathrina and Professor Jeung, for the excellent discussion. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Our next session, Hate Crimes Then and Now, is organized by our sister organization, SCALA, the Southern California Chinese Lawyers Association. It will be on next Tuesday, June 23rd from 12 to 1 p.m. And you can still register. It's at tinyurl.com/APA allyship. If you've already registered for the conference, there's no need to re-register for each session. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.